Point Cape, by Stephen Lake. "The Wave Treader is closing on us," cried the first mate. Brenton stood on the fantail of his ship, the Artigo, and watched as a slick, fast-moving schooner closed rapidly on them from behind. He was amazed at how fast the other ship was. This was only because they were running as absolutely light as possible. To them, the impending bounty of gold they'd soon acquire was worth going hungry or thirsty for a while. Many other ships before them had already done the same as well, with the great number of casks, chests, and other supplies bobbing in the water around them giving witness to this fact. He soon raised his telescope and studied the Wave Treader closely. Suddenly, 2 small puffs of smoke billowed from its deck. A moment later a bullet tore into the railing next to him, and another buzzed past his ear. "Snipers!" cried one of the men. "Sharpshooters, to the rear!" "Cannons at the ready!" cried Brenton. The men scrambled frantically across the deck in obedience to their captain's orders amidst the growing violence of the waves. More shots whizzed past him, but again missed their intended target. Brenton's eyes narrowed at this. He knew why the Wave Treader was shooting at him. All of them were closing in on a place called Point Cape, a very hostile stretch of water that was the dividing point between 2 great seas, and the rumored hiding place of the Pirate King's vast treasure. The only thing that was required to gain access to that treasure was to survive a trip through the Dragon's Teeth, a stretch of water in the middle of the cape that was easily the most dangerous in the entire world. Many ships had gone in. None had ever come out, save for those of the great Pirate King himself. It was rumored that only he knew the key to the Teeth, and how to navigate them safely. It was this very fact that made the Teeth the perfect place to hide his treasure, as it provided a natural fortification against plundering that required no defending by man nor beast, as the sea was more than an ample guardian of it. Another bullet whizzed by Brenton's ear. But he ignored it as his sharpshooters skillfully returned fire and picked off the snipers on the opposing ship, as well as several of her deck crew. This caused the others to scramble for cover. "Helm, 20 degrees to port." "Ready on cannons," he cried. "Aye, 20 degrees to port," echoed the helmsman. "Aye, ready on cannons," cried a gunner. The Artigo quickly adjusted its course and began to slowly close the distance with the Wave Treader. As it did, the gun ports of the Wave Treader belched fire and smoke in their direction like an angry dragon. But, to their dismay, every one of their cannonballs missed its target. This was because, despite the Wave Treader being faster, the Artigo was more stable, meaning that the Wave Treader would have a far more difficult time hitting its target, of which it was. For this, Brenton was grateful. He would soon use this to his advantage. But first he had to get closer to the Wave Treader in order to make his plan work. 23 degrees to port," he shouted. "Aye," replied the helmsman. Brenton watched quietly as his ship closed the distance between himself and the Wave Treader as the other ships struggled to reposition their guns to fire on his ship. But their efforts would ultimately prove to be fruitless. "Snipers! Ready! Aim only for their gunners," he shouted. "Ready," came the reply from his sharpshooters. "Fire at will," shouted Brenton a moment later. Flints sparked, powder flashed and muzzles blazed as shot after shot ripped through the air and expertly struck the crew of the Wave Treader, killing some on the main deck and some below, causing others to scatter for cover. This had the much-desired effect of briefly silencing the guns of the Wave Treader. Her snipers then gathered on the main deck and fired at the Artigo, hoping to return blood for blood with their own sharpshooters. A few of their bullets did find their mark, killing a few of Brenton's sharpshooters in the process. But the immediate reply from Brenton's men to this egregious attack on their ship quickly turned that small victory into a hollow one, as their own sharpshooters were completely wiped out with brutal efficiency, and in a single volley at that. As a casual observer, it didn't take much for the crew of the Wave Treader to realize that Brenton's men were better skilled, and better trained than their own. Quickly becoming desperate for a victory of any kind, the Wave Treader began striking some of her sails in an effort to put herself back into a good firing position. However, Brenton wasn't about to allow this. "Snipers! Clear the rigging," he shouted. Once more his muskets roared, causing men to tumble from the rigging of the Wave Treader. Even so, those men that remained, and had not been hit, continued their work to get the sails pulled in and properly adjusted as fast as possible. But Brenton's snipers soon made that effort impossible as a second musket volley easily cleared out those few who still remained in the rigging like dust off a mantle. Despite this, the Wave Treader wasn't done fighting just yet, as she still had a few tricks up her sleeve, and Brenton knew this. Wanting to bleed off some extra speed, and correct their disadvantage, the Wave Treader steered hard to starboard towards the Artigo. But Brenton had anticipated this. 35 degrees to starboard. Cannons at the ready. Aim for their mid-deck, he shouted. The helmsman of the Artigo expertly maneuvered the ship to starboard, and pulled it into perfect firing position as he did. The crew on the Wave Treader looked on at this in both disbelief and dismay, as the Artigo, once again, had them in perfect killing position, and they couldn't do a thing about it. All they could do now was sit helplessly by and wait for the inevitable. Fire, shouted Brenton a moment later. The Artigo belched a wave of fire moments later, sending cannonballs through the air, and into the side of the Wave Treader, ripping it apart like it was made of balsa wood. But, despite having done an incredible amount of damage to the Wave Treader, their opponent was still in fighting shape. Barely, but still more than able to dish out a punishing blow of her own if she wanted. Knowing this, Brenton quickly set about making sure that would not happen. Helm, hard to port. Starboard side gunners, prepare to fire, he shouted. The crew of the Wave Treader watched in dismay as their upcoming window of opportunity vanished before their eyes as the Artigo turned hard to port, her masts tipping heavily to starboard as she dug deep into the turn. Moments later the ship righted itself, and the Artigo's port side guns blazed, ripping a large hole in the fantail of the Wave Treader as they crossed over her stern. Brenton then steered hard to starboard and fired his port side guns into the Wave Treader, further wounding her. Wanting to do everything they could to save themselves, the Wave Treader turned hard to starboard, hoping beyond hope to overtake the Artigo's turn, and deliver a volley of retribution at their skillful and problematic adversary. However, such would not be their luck as the Artigo's skilled gun crews continued to rain moral fire down on them. Volley after volley was poured into the helpless Wave Treader until she could fight no more. Having won the battle, Brenton stood quietly on the deck of his ship and watched as the other ship began to slowly sink into the sea. Stand down our defenses and resume course towards the teeth, best possible speed. Aye, sir, replied the first mate. The Artigo soon turned back to starboard and continued on her course towards the Cape. As it did, Brenton looked out across the waters around him, and the multitude of shattered, smoldering corpses of countless other ships that covered them. It didn't take much for him to realize that this adventure, a struggle to capture the Pirate King's treasure, would be a winner-takes-all battle for supremacy. The way the other ships' captains were destroying each other in their struggle to secure this legendary and fabled bounty spoke volumes to this fact. All this death and destruction for a little gold, he muttered to himself. It was true that he and his crew were also here for the treasure. But it was for much different reasons. While the others had come in the name of greed, he and his crew instead wanted the treasure so that they could provide the best possible lives for themselves and their families. Most of those among his crew only planned to take what they required, and the rest they would give away to those who were in need. However, first they had to get to the treasure, and that would be no easy task. Especially given the dangers ahead of them. Suddenly, as he was thinking about what he would do next, the Artigo leapt up, and then crashed down hard as a great wave tossed his ship heavily. It wasn't long before another appeared and again tossed the ship. Moments later a loud creak and a groan echoed from the bowels of the ship. Fearing the worst, he quickly hurried to the bow. He then watched as another tall and powerful wave tossed his ship like a cork in a bathtub. He soon realized that the waves were coming from the Cape itself. If they kept this up, they would break his ship in half. From what he could see, others before him had already suffered the same fate, and so would he if he didn't act quickly. He then raced to the stern of the ship. "Helm, angle us into the waves," he shouted. "But Captain, that's suicide." "We need to cut the waves directly," protested the helmsman. The waves are too powerful. They're stressing the keel. If we don't cross the waves, and spread out the weight, they'll break us in two. The helmsman briefly eyed the first mate, who nodded in agreement with Brenton. He soon turned his attention back to the sea ahead as he firmly gripped the helm. "Aye, Captain," he replied. He then turned the ship so that it crossed the waves at an angle. As he did, another ship took the opportunity to cut off the Artigo. But, as it rushed headlong into the waves, one of them caught it amidships and tossed its bow violently into the air. Brenton watched in sickened disgust as the ship then crashed back into the waters with a gut-wrenching thud before snapping in half and slipping quickly beneath the waves, leaving no trace of its existence behind. The speed at which the ship had gone down made the other captains in the area less eager to overtake the Artigo. Instead they turned and followed Brenton's example, cutting the waves at an angle in order to reduce the stress on their ships. A few others, upon seeing this, gave up the chase entirely and turned away. Brenton was glad that they had, as it had already become far more crowded around him than he preferred. He soon returned to the bow of his ship and watched as a group of 9 other vessels ahead of him began forming a single file line as they prepared to enter the cape through a pair of tall, black obelisks that stood watchful guard over its entrance. One of the ships, seeking to overtake the others, suddenly turned hard to starboard as though searching for a swifter, more favorable wind. However, it wasn't long before that ship came to an abrupt and violent halt as its bow buried itself into a hidden sandbar. The force of the impact viciously shook the ship, and sent one of its masts crashing to the deck. A large wave then came in behind it and lifted its fantail high into the air before smashing it down again upon a hidden row of razor-sharp rocks. The ship then creaked and groaned loudly as it struggled with all its might to remain intact. But the next wave that appeared immediately sealed its doom. Brenton and his crew watched in horror as the fantail of the ship was, once again, lifted into the air, and then cast down so violently against the hidden rocks beneath it that it was shattered to pieces. Shortly after this, Brenton noticed that the razor-sharp, sand-covered rocks that had destroyed the other vessel were scattered everywhere on both sides of the channel. Only the main channel itself was safe. Everything else around them was a death trap. This meant that they would need to keep to their course, or else risk losing the ship. There was also no turning back now. The only way left to them at this point was to go straight forward into the cape and all the horrors that lay within. Brenton made his way to the fantail of the ship, near the helm, and watched as one ship after another passed between the 2 obelisks in front of them that marked the entrance. Not far beyond this the ships came upon a massive rock that divided the channel in 2. Upon reaching this rock, the first 3 ships, one by one, carefully turned to port, and vanished soon after behind high, jagged walls of stone. He then felt his ship lurch forward under him. This drew his curiosity. So he leaned over the side, and noticed that a powerful current was now pushing his ship along. Seeing this, he knew that he would have to be careful. While the current would solve his problem of sailing inside the cape, it also meant that he would have far less control over where his ship went. He looked up again and noticed that only 2 ships now remained that had not yet made their turns. He then carefully studied the lead ship as it first appeared as though it would turn to port, just like the others, but then suddenly changed course to starboard at the last moment. The other ship behind it did the same. Brenton found this intriguing. "Prepare to go starboard," he said. "But Captain, the other ships all went to port, save for those 2, said the helmsman. "And we would have as well, had I not seen the lead ship change their course suddenly." "It's likely that they saw something that the others did not," said Brenton. "Aye, Captain." The Artigo then continued on its previous course for several moments longer before turning starboard in the same way as the previous 2 ships had. Slipping into a cavern, just beyond the turn, Brenton found that its ceiling became far lower than he liked. Thankfully his masts were still short enough to allow them through it with little trouble. They soon emerged into a much wider passageway where they found that the 2 halves of the channel rejoined again into one. But, just as they came to this merging of the waters, they looked back and were horrified to discover that the left side channel had actually been full of razor-sharp stalactites and stalagmites which formed what appeared to be a many-layered set of teeth. These teeth had, in turn, torn to shreds any and every ship that had entered through that way. Now I understand why they call this passageway the Dragon's Teeth, thought Brenton. A few moments later, two bodies emerged from the left side channel and floated towards them, along with a sizable amount of wood, debris and wreckage. Brenton took off his hat and pressed it against his chest in a show of respect for the fallen. God have mercy on their souls, said the first mate. Aye, replied Brenton. The ship then lurched again as the current suddenly gained speed. Captain, look, cried the first mate. Ahead of them, rising out of the water, was a series of sharp, jutting rocks that forced the channel to move faster and more erratically, as it flowed around them like a gigantic, slithering snake. Brenton then looked up at his sails and noticed that they were now slack against the breeze. This meant that they weren't going to help him power his way around the stones. Instead, he would be forced to use the current to his advantage, and trust greatly in the skill of his helmsman to make it through this next challenge. He then looked over the side of the ship and studied the flow of the water. It was moving in a deceptively, confusing pattern. Moments later the lead ship ahead of him entered the snaking channel of water, bumping into several things as it did before suddenly getting snagged on a hidden sandbar. This allowed the raging water to quickly tear the ship apart and drag its shattered remains under the water. The next ship, however, was able to successfully avoid the mistakes of the first and, in turn, safely navigate the channel. The Artigo soon did the same, taking the example of the second ship to steer safely through the challenging obstacles before them. As they came out the other side, Brenton sighed in relief. So far, so good, he thought. He wondered how many more challenges he would have to face, and if his ship and crew would even make it out of this alive. He then smiled slightly. If they did, there would be a lot less competitors for him to deal with when they returned home, as many of the most foolish and greedy among them would soon be eliminated by the Cape and its multitude of traps and snares. Suddenly he heard a sloshing growl echo from the waters. Just ahead of him was a series of stony spikes that protruded up from the water below, and down from the ceiling above at the same time, blocking their path. This struck fear into every man on the ship as it was very obvious that these rocks were completely impassable. But then something happened that amazed everyone. They all watched in wonder as the water began to rise up, lifting the ship before them high enough that they were able to easily pass safely over the spikes in the water. It then dove down again soon after, allowing the ship to easily slip under the spikes in the ceiling. Just then, Brenton realized what was happening. Steady as she goes, he said. But, Captain, don't you see the danger? Protested the helmsman. I do. And that is why we will be able to avoid them, whereas others will not. Aye, sir, said the helmsman. Brenton watched anxiously as his ship quickly approached the spikes ahead as the water in the channel continued to retreat. Eventually, though, it began rising again, and within moments the spikes had vanished completely beneath the waves, allowing the Artigo to safely pass over them. Brenton then watched anxiously as they approached the next obstacle, a series of sharp spikes hanging from the ceiling. Moments later, just like with the previous ship, as they drew close to the spikes, the water subsided, clearing the way for his ship to safely pass under them. However, the water wasn't receding fast enough for the ship in front of them to safely clear the spikes. And, sure enough, just as it passed under the great spikes in the ceiling, one of its masts grazed several of them, dislodging them from the ceiling, and sending them crashing into the deck below. These, in turn, crashed through the ship, and out the bottom, punching great holes in it. This caused the ship ahead of them to quickly take on water. The ship then began to slowly ride lower and lower in the water as she gradually began to sink. To make matters worse, this now made her sit too low in the water to escape the next set of teeth that lay ahead. And, with the gut-wrenching sound of shattering boards and rending planks, the ship was driven into those vicious stone teeth, and destroyed. She vanished beneath the waves moments later. Realizing that there was very little room for error, Brenton carefully studied the water ahead as he searched for a solution to the puzzle of the teeth. He soon realized what he needed to do. Steer out of the main channel. We need to slow our ship, he said. Aye, Captain, replied the helmsman. The Art Ego then pulled to the side of the channel, and into the slower currents near the edge of it, which quickly brought the Artego's wild, forward pace to a slow crawl. Another ship, that was behind them in the channel, soon caught up to them, and drove past them into the teeth, where it too was destroyed. A few moments later, Brenton ordered his ship back into the channel again. Having timed his return perfectly, the Art Ego safely flowed over the first row of teeth, under the spikes in the ceiling, past the second row of teeth, a second group of spikes in the ceiling, and then over a final set of teeth at the end of the passageway. The channel then narrowed and sped up briefly before opening out into a large, shallow bay. Moments later the wind returned and quickly filled his sails. Trying to determine what he should do next, he raised his telescope and scouted the entire shoreline of the bay. As he did, he spotted a large house made of stone sitting on the shore. In front of it was the symbol of the Pirate King perched awkwardly in the sand. Brenton smiled. They'd finally found the treasure they'd come for. Now all they had to do was claim it. Strike the sails and lower the anchor. "We're going ashore," he said. "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. A few minutes later, Brenton, his first mate, and 5 other sailors all climbed into one of the longboats and quickly rowed their way to shore. Upon reaching land, they climbed out and approached the stone house cautiously. Inside they found nothing but a simple wooden table, in the middle of which sat a small stone tablet. Brenton picked it up, brushed off the dust, and read it. "Silver and gold have I none to give ye, nor treasure that might make ye rich, save only for this one thing. If ye hast made it thus far, then thou hast gained the only treasure that I can give ye, thy life. For there is none other treasure under the heavens, and in the sea, that is greater than this." Brenton put the tablet down on the table and turned to his men, who looked at him excitedly. However, his expression soon drained all hope and excitement from them. "Where's the treasure, Captain?" asked the first mate. "It appears that we've been tricked, and there is no treasure. Just a note from the Pirate King congratulating us on successfully surviving the Cape," said Brenton. "No treasure," said the first mate in surprise. Brenton nodded. "It would seem not. However, while we have not found the very thing that we sought for, we can still come away from this adventure with the knowledge that we have survived the greatest challenge that any man can ever know, and do so with our lives still intact. That, in itself, is a reward beyond words. And, while I know it will not fill our bellies, we can at least feel blessed that we still have something that can be filled." The first mate nodded sadly. "Aye, Captain. If you say so." The men then turned and plodded back to the longboat feeling discouraged and defeated as they did. They'd all come along on this journey with a deep-seated hope of gaining a portion of the Pirate King's vast treasure. Instead they were leaving empty-handed. Even so, Brenton knew that merely surviving all they'd just gone through was treasure enough. He then turned and strolled out to the longboat. However, as he did, the words of the tablet rattled in his mind. He knew the king of the pirates to be a brilliant man. But to die with no treasure, after enjoying unspeakable riches his entire life, seemed out of place to him. So Brenton turned and walked back towards the house as the first mate looked on curiously. "What's the matter, Captain?" he asked. "There's something I want to check on. I fear that we may have missed something." The first mate found this curious and followed his captain back to the stone house. He knew Brenton to be a brilliant man. So if he was having second thoughts about what they'd found, then the first mate was willing to help him investigate it. Brenton soon walked back into the little stone house and looked around it carefully, doing his very best to observe every part of it with great detail. He soon picked up the stone tablet again and studied it carefully. To his surprise, as he examined it more closely, he realized that it wasn't just a simple message, but rather a clue, and a very well disguised one at that. A smile soon drew across his face. Well, crafty as always, aren't we, Captain?" he said to himself. "What is it, sir?" asked his first mate. Brenton turned and showed the tablet to him. "What we thought was a simple message of defeat is actually a clue, my friend. Just like those that led us here, this is yet another piece in the puzzle of the great Pirate King's secret treasure, and its whereabouts." The first mate looked at him in confusion. "What are you saying?" he asked. Brenton pointed to the tablet, and then the table. "The clue we are searching for is not in this tablet, but rather the very place in which we stand." The first mate scratched his head in confusion. "I do not understand, Captain," he replied. Brenton gestured to the house around him. "The answer is right before us. We stand within a lonely stone house, inside of which is a rock of wisdom that rests upon a table of fellowship. That is the clue that the great pirate king has left us. But only those who have wisdom can see it," he replied. The first mate studied his captain's face for several moments before suddenly realizing the meaning of the clue. "Boulder House," he exclaimed. "Exactly. Our next clue awaits us at the lighthouse, on the table of the four absent kings, outside of the village of Boulder House," exclaimed Brenton. "Brilliant, Captain. Once again the Pirate King shows us just how incredibly wise he was, and you even more so." Brenton nodded as he placed the tablet down on the table again. "Indeed it does. Thus, that is to be our next destination. Now, ready the crew, as we must first make our way out of here, and into the open sea, after which we will make haste to reach the lighthouse before anyone else does." The first mate saluted, and said, "Aye, aye, Captain." The end.